Jonathan Lamb has been silently standing in his father's shadow for years. He finally speaks out about the billion-dollar-day business in a stunning interview, and what he says has everyone talking. Was it inherited strength or faith? Nobody anticipated the complexity, depth, and darkness of the reality behind the cameras. Money isn't the only factor here. It concerns a son, legacy, and control. Torn between devotion and the truth. Everyone assumed the throne would go to Jonathan Lamb. After all, his father, Marcus Lamb, the creator of the Daystar Television Network, had guaranteed it in writing, signed it, and sealed it. On the surface, it appeared to be a done deal. Marcus had built an empire of Christians over the world for decades. And Jonathan had spent years with him. He was more than the son. He was the heir apparent, the one selected to continue the family tradition. And for a time, it did appear as though that would occur. Jonathan was formally appointed vice president in 2021 upon Marcus's death. He appeared on the camera. He assumed more leadership duties. He and his spouse, Susie, even experienced a significant increase in their earnings. For the first time. They had never felt more financially secure. All signs pointed to a seamless transition for a short season. The son would succeed his father. The vision would go on. The empire would stay in the family, but the pledge made in writing subtly fell apart, thus that chapter was never fully opened. In private, things were moving. Decisions about leadership were being made without consulting Jonathan. He was not invited to meetings that were taking place. The assurances that had been so firm began to wane. Daystar's internal energy shifted. Passing the baton was no longer the focus. The goal was to completely reroute the marathon. Even worse, Jonathan and Susie didn't simply lose their jobs. They lost the future they had spent a lifetime building. It was not a matter of professional aspirations. It was intensely spiritual and intimate. Years of Jonathan's life had been dedicated to the network. He had been dedicated and humble in his service. The strategy that everyone believed was set in stone abruptly became hazy. The audience was not informed. The whole tale. Rather, it seemed to them that Jonathan and Susie had just moved on, as though it had been a mutually agreeable decision. However, such was not the reality. They were exhausted, yet they didn't leave. The route they were promised was never followed, therefore they left. The leadership that should have been theirs was transferred in a different way. There was a peaceful departure and the silent disintegration of a once clear legacy, no major altercation or public spectacle. Jonathan had spent the most of his life preparing for the reign he was supposed to inherit, but it never came. However, there is an ancient story out there. They're multi-millionaires, I see. This multi-million-dollar ministry employs them. Has this had a financial impact on you guys? Has it negatively impacted your finances? As vice president of JAR, I had a really big salary just in that year of 23. Oh, no, that was in 22. Before that, we were always normal for 2023. It was still a nice no, but it was like massive at 2022 full-time vice president for a whole year. We were shocked because people wanted to act like you still had to pay a mortgage. The man who was born to lead Daystar left because the door was no longer open, not because he wasn't ready, but because we still had debts to pay from living a lifestyle that was supported by a much greater set of income, both of us. The promised throne turned into the one that never existed. And what's left is a strong beginning rather than a sad conclusion. A tale of standing by the truth even when it entails giving up what you believe to be yours. Neither Jonathan Lamb nor Susie Lamb left Daystar because they were worn out, because the spotlight had faded, or because they didn't think they had a future there. They were no longer able to pretend, so they left. And there was a heavy cost associated with that choice. They had diligently served for years. Jonathan was more than a mere employee. He was the heir. The one Marcus Lamb had invested in, cultivated, and designated as his heir. There was the documentation. Plans were developed. Everyone in the vicinity of the network was aware of the impending event. The throne was meant to pass to Jonathan. However, everything changed quickly after Marcus's death. Initially, everything proceeded as planned. Jonathan became vice president in his place. For the first time, he and Susie were financially secure. They were living peacefully for the first time in years. It was an excellent salary. The road ahead appeared safe. It appeared as though they had finally reached the time of year they had been waiting for after years of hardship and sacrifice. However, there was a problem underneath. Susie sensed it. Jonathan sensed it. They couldn't ignore the anguish in their conscience, the spiritual restlessness. When some individuals started to resurface in private meetings, the first crack appeared. The faces that had hurt them. Once dismissed as rumors, these conversations now felt uncomfortably near to the truth. According to such rumors, a member of the Lamb family had hurt their daughter. The quiet surrounding the accusations was deafening, even if they weren't new. No accountability, no investigation, just business as usual. Furthermore, Jonathan and Susie couldn't ignore that. Joni Lamb, meanwhile, was on the move. She wore the mask of a mourning wife in public. However, behind closed doors, decisions were being made quickly and accurately. Suddenly, Marcus was reviving projects that he had put on hold. The roles of leadership were changing. Most significantly, Joni's connection to Dr. Doug Weiss started to come to light. He wasn't merely offering advice. He was entering discussions about leadership. He was acting. Called in not only as a consultant but also as a potential business and personal partner. That was more than just awkward for Susie and Jonathan. It was startling. Their entire understanding of morality, religion, and family was being completely upended. Jonathan thought they were intended to uphold the values Marcus had established the network on, but they were subtly being replaced with something different. They were being urged to keep quiet about it, comply, smile, and act as though nothing had changed. Jonathan would have been elected president if they had consented to that and cooperated. They would still have been respected, safe, and affluent. But at what price? He became vice president, therefore I got a boost in 22. Prior to that, when things truly reached a head, you would think that if anything, we would be tempted to stay when we arrived in 22 after Dad went away, and I and Jonathan both received pretty great salaries, but we were more prepared than ever at that time. When will Jonathan be ready? I mean, it was the struggle and breaking of me, pleading with God. I'm prepared to sell this house now. I'm prepared for a fresh start. We can pick from 50 states. We sacrificed everything for the sake of truth. If we'd just accepted the charade, set aside our morals, read the card, congratulate my mom on her marriage, and kept not questioning anything about Pete, the solution became evident. To stay would be to make concessions. It would entail ignoring problems that had a significant impact on their family. It would entail seeing a person who has harmed them move freely within the structure. It would imply that pretending that Joni's hasty remarriage to Doug Weiss, which occurred only a few months after Marcus's passing, was a non-issue. Above all, it would entail giving up their vocation in favor of luxury. As a result, they left behind a billion-dollar network, titles, luxury, and assurance. And they accomplished it without creating a stir, releasing statements to the media, or throwing anyone under the bus. They just went with the truth. The whole cost then became apparent. The silence became loud as soon as they left. Relationships of trust become chilly. Old pals vanished. They were losing a neighborhood as well as their career. They were questioned. A few even turned on them. Inside Daystar, the narrative was swiftly revised. It has nothing to do with beliefs. Rebellion was at issue. It had nothing to do with conscience. It has to do with pride. Susie and Jonathan, however, said nothing. They knew God would tell their narrative in His own time, not because they had none to share. They were praying, arguing, and asking God what to do next behind the scenes. They also admitted to crying on few nights during their interview. Because doing the right thing frequently hurts, not because they regretted their choice. Honesty is costly. It costs comfort, security, opportunities, and relationships. Susie and Jonathan, however, felt it was worthwhile. They made a fresh start based on faith rather than a well-defined plan or substantial savings. The time had come for them to depart the house. Prepared to start over and follow God wherever He lead, even if it meant being forgotten because they weren't adhering to a platform. They were doing what God had commanded. And they found serenity in that silent surrender. They didn't anticipate cheers. They had no desire for recognition. They desired to be able to gaze into their daughter's eyes with the knowledge that they had safeguarded her. To sleep with the knowledge that they made no concessions. Should have faith, even if it meant going it alone. They decided to leave that legacy. The story of Jonathan and Susie is still being told today. The name is no longer associated with them. Daystar, yet they have never been more rooted in their identity. Their bravery in leaving revealed more than just flaws in a system. It demonstrated what true faith looks like under duress. Nor shouting, nor yelling, just calm, steady, and unwaveringly submissive. Because getting higher doesn't always lead to the greatest marvels. They result from leaving while everything in the world is obvious. To remain. Every believer must make a decision on what is most important at some point in their lives. Conviction or comfort. That moment for Jonathan and Susie Lamb happened in private, behind the scenes, when no one was looking. They had it all on the outside. A prominent role in one of the world's largest Christian networks. A future assured, impact. Stability. A name that was respected in practically every Christian community. Something didn't sit right on the inside, though, and it persisted. Viewers, employees, and the Christian community expected Jonathan would continue the tradition after Marcus Lamb's death. It was logical. He was the son. He had been doing his duty. The vision was familiar to him. Even in writing, Marcus had said unequivocally that Jonathan was the next in line. That was the strategy. The promise was that. And everything appeared to be moving in that direction for a brief period of time. Jonathan assumed the vice presidential position. Susie was promoted. In terms of money, they were in the greatest location they had ever visited. It felt like they had finally made it after years of eking out a livelihood, living on a meager salary, and making sacrifices for the ministry. They had reached the point that most people can only imagine. However, many felt apprehensive rather than excited or relieved. Little things were the first. Changes in leadership, newcomers attending meetings behind closed doors. Concepts and plans for the future that lacked the same ideals and spirit upon which Marcus had founded the ministry. Then came the private part, the bit that was hidden from the public. Unresolved family conflicts and accusations against a Lamb family member had a significant impact on Jonathan and Susie's daughter. Juhowever, nothing was done. Silence, no responsibility, no meaningful dialogue. Simply move forward. Then Junie remarried Doug Weiss, who was a Christian counselor, but whose presence and function in the ministry caused Jonathan and Susie to have severe concerns. Judging wasn't the point. It was about discernment, about seeing the principles they were taught to live by and the values they had been reared on supplanted by damage control and image management. They had the option to stay quiet. They could have complied with everything and kept their heads down. Jonathan would have been elected president. They would have had a stable income. They would have expanded their platform. Stability would have been a comfort to their daughter. However, what would have been the price for them? According to Susie, it was a persistent nudge and a spiritual upheaval. She wasn't asking for money in prayer. She wasn't even asking God to give her clarity. She was praying for a way out, for the courage to leave if God so desired. Jonathan was also struggling with what it would mean to stay, in addition to what was going on around him. Could he face himself in the mirror with the knowledge that he had compromised his morals for financial gain? When he finally turned to face himself in the mirror, he saw he had gave up the truth in order to get paid. If he had permitted those who had harmed his daughter to go unpunished, could he look at her and tell her that he had protected her? Faith is more than just what we think when things are going well. It's about the decisions we make when everything is on the line. And that meant that Jonathan and Susie had to choose conviction over status, truth over comfort, and trust over luck. They decided in silence. There wasn't press conference, no statement on social media. They just left a ministry worth billions of dollars, job titles and six-figure salaries, and the security that most people strive for their entire lives because they understood deep down that continuing would require making concessions. And there was no way to do that. Some were unable to comprehend. There are still some that don't. From the outside, it appeared careless, sentimental, even stupid. Why would you abandon the legacy, the power, and the very thing your ancestors created? However, the entire story was unknown to those individuals. The conversations that felt like spiritual warfare, the prayers, the tears, and the restless nights were invisible to them. Susie and Jonathan weren't looking for attention. They were chasing the only type of calm that can come when you follow orders, even if it means losing everything. They gave up comfort, sold their home, and began anew with only faith. Nevertheless, they claim that they have never felt more liberated. Because wealth or prestige do not equate to freedom. It results from being aware that you did not betray your soul. It results from leaving when your gut tells you it's the appropriate thing to do. It would have been simple to stay, to nod in meetings, to grin on camera, to seem as though nothing was wrong, even if everyone else said it was. But they weren't like that. They were not summoned to participate. They were commanded to lead moral lives. They then put everything on the table. They meant it when Jonathan said, "We laid everything on the altar for the truth." They lost their inheritance, their influence, and their titles as a result of the reality. However, it restored their tranquility. It restored their sharpness. Most significantly, it restored their voice. A voice that could at last speak without restraint or fear. It's not a spectacular story, but a voice that might say, "We chose God over the game." It's devoid of retaliation or resentment. It is dignified, calm, and steady. To make a point, they didn't just leave. They realized they had to leave, so they did. This is the type of faith that isn't always praised. However, it's the type that transforms everything. Do you regret it? Is still a question that people ask them, and they always give the same response. Not for a moment. Because they gained faith in place of what they lost in luck. They got back in tranquility what they had given up in comfort. And in purpose, they discovered what they had lost in empire. Their story serves as a reminder that true bravery isn't always demonstrated by performing on a stage. It appears as though one is walking off of it. Real faith doesn't always look like clinging. It appears to be letting go. And leaving everything behind is sometimes the richest thing you can do. Because ultimately, if you lose yourself, what good is it to gain the entire world? Susie and Jonathan remained themselves. In the process, they discovered God and themselves, not in the flash of a billion-dollar brand, but in the silent, expensive obedience of saying, "Yes, Lord." Even today, when most people think of legacy, they think of financial platforms and the type of success that gets. In the Christian world, Daystar was his family's empire, and for years, it was thought that he would be the one to continue it. That's what Jonathan Lamb was born into, being featured in publications or receiving standing ovations. However, leaving a legacy doesn't always mean stealing the show. At times, it comes down to what you are prepared to give up. Not because you were rejected or failed, but rather because you made a decision that went beyond success. You opted for conviction, truth, and tranquility. Following Marcus Lamb's death in 2021, everything appeared to be in order. This was the moment Jonathan had been prepared for. There was a written succession plan. He was named vice president by the ministry. Susie, his wife, was given a raise. They had at last achieved financial stability, which they had not gone through for years. Every indication suggested a strong and safe future. But beneath it all, a silent storm was building. The documentation wasn't the issue. It has nothing to do with qualifications. Jonathan was prepared, but the ministry's culture, principles, and spirit were rapidly shifting. What had seemed sacrosanct began to feel contrived. What was once about faith is now resembled picture control. And when some facts came to light, facts that had a devastating and personal impact on their family, Jonathan and Susie had to make a choice that no amount of planning could have made simple. They had the option to remain silent and adhere to the script. The throne would have been theirs without a doubt if they had maintained their line, smiled on camera, and said everything correctly. However, there was a single issue. It was no longer only a network. Who would be president was not the only issue. Whether or if they could still identify themselves in the mirror had turned into a test of their honesty. It wasn't the drama or the suspense that stung the most. It was the inaction when circumstances called for a reaction, the absence of responsibility when actual harm occurred, and the change in focus. All of it was too much to overlook. Jonathan was aware that they would be complicit if they stayed. So they went. Quiet, non-violent resistance, not with a press conference, not with resentment. They didn't clash. They did not scream. They didn't make accusations. They just took a step back and stopped talking. They chose to follow the calm pole in their spirit over wealth, status, and authority. They opted for truth over image and faith for dominion. Marcus left behind a significant, influential, and well-respected legacy. Jonathan, however, was not called to protect it at all costs. Even though he was called to walk in obedience. Everything his father had built was at stake. That is not a simple task. It's not glitzy. It's the kind of obedience that heaven sees, but it doesn't come with accolades or cheers. The sort that leaves a lasting legacy. Susie once remarked that stability isn't always the path to peace. It can occasionally be discovered in surrender. And that's just what they found when they left. They discovered tranquility. Not the kind that results from ease but rather from understanding. From knowing that, despite the pain, you made the correct decision. Even as it cost you your platform.